Welcome to another session of CSIT 311. Session 4 will be handling risk management. As an overview, this session explores a variety of control approaches and follows a discussion on how controls can be categorized. The session finishes with a section on maintaining effective controls in the modern IT organization. So our outline for this session will be as follows. We'll look at an overview of risk management, we'll look at risk identification, risk assessment, risk control strategies, selecting a risk control strategy, then we'll end with quantitative versus qualitative risk control practices. The reading for this session can be found in chapter 4 of the recommended text. Let's take an overview of risk management. As an overview of risk management, you first of all need to know yourself. By that, you are to be able to identify, examine, and understand the information and systems currently in place. After that, you are to know the enemy. That is, be able to identify, examine, and understand threats facing the organization. With that said, we need to understand how the organization looks like. On top of the charts, as you can see before you, is the risk management, which is subdivided into risk identification, risk assessment, and risk control. Under risk identification, we can see that you need to identify and also make inventory of assets. You need to classify and prioritize your assets. Then you need to identify and prioritize the threats. Under risk assessment, you need to identify vulnerabilities between assets and threats, and identify and quantify asset exposure. Then finally, under risk control, you should be able to select a strategy, you justify the controls, and implement and monitor the controls. So let's take them. First and foremost, under risk identification. Here, assets and targets of various threats and threat agents are looked at. Then, the risk management process of identifying and controlling risks facing an organization is done. Then we also look at the risk identification, which begins with identifying organizations' assets and assessing their value. And all of these are done and is categorized under risk identification. So we should be able to know the assets which are targets of the various threats and the threat agent. You're supposed to be able to know the risk management processes of identifying and controlling risk facing the organization. You should be able also to know the risk identification, which begins with identifying the organization's assets and assessing their value. If you look at the charts, you'll see it in detail where you need to plan and organize the process, you categorize the system components, and so on and so forth. So you specify the asset's vulnerability. Let's move on to risk assessment. What happens under risk assessment? With risk assessment, the risk assessment here evaluates the relative risk for each vulnerability. Then you assign a risk rating or score to each information asset. After doing that, the goal at this point is to create a method for evaluating the relative risk of each listed vulnerability. After going through the risk assessment, then we'll take a look at risk control strategies. Once ranked vulnerability risk whole sheet is complete, you must choose one of 5 strategies to control each risk. So you choose either to apply safeguards, which is a defensive mechanism, or you can transfer the risk, which is a transfer, or you can choose to reduce the impact, by which case you are mitigating, or you can choose to understand consequences and accept risk acceptance. Then you can choose to avoid activities that are too risky. It means you terminate. Now, what is involved in selecting a risk control strategy? In selecting a risk control strategy, first of all, the level of threats and value of assets play a major role in selection of a strategy. The rule of thumb on strategy selection can be applied. And what does it entail? When a vulnerability exists, that's the first thing to look at. Then when a vulnerability can be exploited, you can select a risk control strategy. When attacker's cost is less than potential gain, this is also another strategy selection application. And when the potential loss is substantial, it's also another point for risk control strategy selection. We can take a critical look at it now in this chart. If you look at the chart carefully, for the flow of the chart from the left on the second level, you see here that a system is designed. So whatever system that you are dealing with has its own design. Then moving on, we'll ask ourselves, is the system vulnerable? If no, then there's no risk. On the other hand, if yes, then we might want to go a step further to ask, is the system exploitable after it's being vulnerable? If no, once again, then there's no risk. But if yes, we can conclude then that a vulnerability exists. In which case, we can say that there's a threat and there's a vulnerability which both exist. So if you look on the top of the chart, you can see that we need to identify a viable threat. At this point, we can see that a threat and a vulnerability exist, which leads us down to the second part of the chart, which indicates that if the risk exists, what do? We then go to ask ourselves, is the attacker's gain greater than the cost? If no, then the risk may be accepted. It is in this case that you accept the risk. Remember, we looked at the cases in which you need to select a risk control strategy. So in this instance, if the attacker's gain is greater than the cost, then we'll have to ask ourselves, is the expected loss greater than the organization's acceptance level? If no, the risk should be accepted also. Then if yes, then it's an unacceptable risk. So this is just a chart to indicate how to go about the selection of the risk control strategy. Then we'll take a look at the quantitative versus qualitative risk control practices. The very first one is feasibility studies. Before deciding on any strategy at all information about economic or non-economic consequences of vulnerability of information assets must be explored. And this is a very important step. Then after that, a number of ways exist to determine advantages of a specific control, one of which is the cost-benefit analysis. So the most common approach for deciding on information security controls is the economic feasibility of implementation. Then the cost-benefit analysis, which can refer to as the CBA, is done. We begin this by evaluating the worth of assets to be protected and the loss in value if those assets are compromised. After which we do the formal process to document this, and it's called the cost-benefit analysis or economic feasibility study. Moving on, once the value of assets is estimated, potential loss from exploitation of vulnerability is studied. Then the process result is estimated, gives us the estimate of potential loss per risk. Then the expected loss per risk stated is done in the following equation. So we have the annualized loss expectancy, the ALE, then the SLE, which is the single loss expectancy, then the ARO, which is the annualized rate of occurrence. So we pick the single loss expectation, which is equal to asset value times exposure factor, the EF. Now, we do all this because we need this for the cost-benefit analysis formula, which states that the ALE minus the ALE afterwards. So the ALE prior minus the ALE afterwards, which is the annualized loss expectation, the expectancy, minus the ACE, gives us the entire cost-benefit analysis. After that, we realize that the CBA is helping us to determine if there's an alternative being evaluated, and is it worth the cost incurred to control the vulnerability, and so on and so forth. Another thing also that we want to look at is the evaluation, assessment, and maintenance of risk controls. Now, selection and implementation of control strategies is not the end of the process. The strategy and accompanying controls must be monitored, re-evaluated, on ongoing basis to determine effectiveness and to calculate more accurately the estimated residual risk. Now, the process continues as long as organization continues to function. And evaluation, assessment, and maintenance of risk controls is an unending process. So you keep doing it, just because you need to be able to, at all times, calculate more accurately the estimated residual risk. So this chart here also summarizes what we've just spoken about. Then we take a look at the quantitative versus qualitative risk control practices. Now, performing the previous steps using actual values or estimates is known as quantitative assessment. Now, possible to complete steps using evaluation process based on characteristics using non-numerical measures is what we will term as qualitative. So the quantitative is more geared towards putting values, actual values to whatever estimate that we have made, whilst the qualitative is more concerned about the use of non-numerical measures to be able to find the evaluation of whatever the estimates of the steps that we are evaluating is about. Now, utilizing scales rather than specific estimates relieves organization from difficulty to determine exact values. Let's look at benchmarking and best practices. An alternative approach of seeking out and studying practices in other organizations that one's own organization desires to duplicate. So you have your own company and you are to benchmark. It suggests that there's another company which you desire to be able to use or mimic based on certain practices that they are going about. They become the company that you are looking up to. So for your organization, they become the benchmark. They become the baseline, the standard that you're looking on to be able to go about your own affairs or businesses in your organization. Now, one of two measures typically is used to compare the practices. The first one is merits-based measures, and the other is the process-based measures. Now, there are problems with the application of benchmarking and best practices. What are they? First of all, organizations don't talk to each other. Organizations are usually in competition with one another, so there isn't room for chat. So this poses a big challenge, because if you're going to use one company A as your benchmark and you are not, because you're in competition for the market, you are not in communication, it's going to pose a problem, because you might not have the true picture of what company A, which you're using as your benchmark, practices really is. And that can pose a very big problem with the application of the benchmarking and best practices of that company. The second one is that no two organizations are identical. No matter how closely related company A's activities are to what you want to do in your company B, you are not the same. You might have different ideals, different visions, and so on and so forth. So that also poses a problem with how you want to apply best practices from that company you are using as your benchmark. Now, knowing what was going on in information security industry in recent years through benchmarking doesn't necessarily prepare for what's next. Now, this means that knowledge of what is past or what has happened with regards to information security does not necessarily prepare you for the future, because it's not going to be a repetition of what has happened. Technology is changing, how information security is changing, how attacks are happening and threats are happening is always changing. So it's always poses a problem. So the benchmarking and the best practice of that company that you're looking up to might not necessarily have the state of the art, because they can't predict what is to happen before you. And this also poses a challenge. Lastly, we want to look at baselining. Now, analysis of measures against established standards. When you analyze measures against certain established standards, it helps you to form a baseline. It's like the ground level from where you start operating from. In information security, baselining in comparison of security activities and events against an organization's future performance. So baselining in information security is comparison of security activities and events against an organization's future performance. So when you look at the organization's security activities and its events, and you compare it to the organization's future performance, it helps you to know the baseline with regards to information security. Lastly, it is useful during baselining to have a guide to the overall process. So most definitely, you don't just jump on to start baselining. You need to go for a standard, which is going to be a guide to help you to move on. With this, we come to the end of this session. Thank you very much.